Hello and welcome to this second webinar in the WorldWood webinar introductory webinar series. The first one I didn't record, so anyone who's going to be listening to the recording of this, I'll have to record that one when I go through this entire series. Just the way this is going to work is we're going to have a series of introductory ones, which you don't need any prior knowledge for, and then once we've done through these, we'll run another series of these same ones, plus another one on more advanced levels for people who have already been to listen to this. All right. By the way, if anyone has any questions or comments or wants to contribute at any time, just put something in the chat or start speaking. This is meant to be really informal and really talkative. I don't want to end up talking the entire time. So if anyone has any questions, ideas, queries, whatever they want, just feel free to say. So I think the best thing, this is titled Restoration Technology and Stumbling Blocks. And I'll get on to why I've used those terms in a minute. But the first thing to look at is the challenges that we're faced when we're trying to carry out restoration. So restoration is a very simple idea that not only do we have to take our emissions to net zero, and not only do we have to stop making the problem worse, but we have to remove enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to actively make things better. So not only do we have to stop putting carbon dioxide in, but then we have to remove a very, very large amount to try to get the climate back to a state which is kind of acceptable. This isn't going to be an argument for why we should have restoration. That was last week's webinar. This is more kind of, is it possible? And if so, how do we carry it out kind of thing? So what are the challenges? Firstly, we've been emitting carbon dioxide for 200 years into the atmosphere at large scales. Actually over 200 years. And so if we're going to reverse that, we're going to have to reverse 200 years of emissions. Obviously, it was not the scale today, 200 years ago, but we still have to reverse 200 years worth of emissions. So that's a big task. Secondly, we currently emit 40 gigatons of CO2 per year. So the longer we carry on putting this off for, not only putting off restoration, but putting off even reducing our emissions, then the more removal we'll need to do. Because 40 gigatons, that's 40 billion tons of CO2. So the more we wait, and every year matters, every day frankly matters now. Every day for us to get our carbon dioxide emissions to net zero, to stop putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, matters. Now, when we're looking at ways that we can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, this might all sound quite theoretical at the moment, but I'll give you some concrete examples. And this is what we use to kind of decide what the challenges are with different removal technologies. Firstly, the scale. Can we scale it up? Can we scale this up to a large scale? And so therefore the problems there come up with land use. If we're using huge amounts of land, we won't be able to scale it up to huge scales because we'll have to compete with food production or with our cities. Does it use a huge amount of energy? In which case, is that going to mean we're going to be burning more fossil fuels to run this? And also, how much does it cost? If this is costing us $200 per ton, we can't do 40 billion of those every single year. Saturation. This means where we're putting the carbon dioxide, continue to have it put in there for a very long time? Or will it, after a certain amount of time, basically, you cannot put any more carbon dioxide in there? Because it's all right removing carbon dioxide, but eventually, if we've got nowhere to put it, then it's just not going to be very useful. Imagine it like we're trying to remove water from a bath and putting in a sink with a plug hole. If the sink's really small, we might be able to move one bucket of water from the bath and then no more, because there's no more that can go in the sink. Permanence. Will the sink suddenly re-emit the CO2, or is actually storing it permanently? A really good example is trees, for example. Trees burn, and when trees burn, they release all the CO2 they took out back into the atmosphere. So that's a very unpermanent sink. And the final problem is humanitarian and development issues. Is these removals going to negatively impact our ability to actually make a better world? Is this going to negatively impact people's health? Is this going to negatively impact social justice, the sustainable development goals that you can see here? Is it going to negatively impact? So we've got to go through all of those factors. Is everyone okay with this so far? Does anyone have any questions on any of these ideas of the scale and the challenges of the problem that we're facing at the moment? All right. If no one does, feel free to chat or put it in the chat. All right, then I'll just move on. So one of the first things we've got to look at is actually the scale of removal necessary to carry out this dream of restoration, this dream of removing as much of the carbon dioxide as we put into the atmosphere as possible. I take, oh, did you have a question? No. The first thing is just as the scale we need is as much as is physically possible, because every small percentage matters, and we're never going to be able to remove more than we put in, really. So the aim is to just remove as much as what we have already historically put in there as possible. To fully restore, as of, this is a Carbon Brief article as of 2012, to fully restore, we need to remove 1,375 billion tons of CO2. That's a gigaton, a billion tons of CO2. That was as of 2012. This is likely about 1,700 billion tons now in the last 8 years. And by 2030, it will be over 2,000 gigatons. And it's like that estimate I put there is likely an underestimate unless we seriously get our act together now. Currently, the study by the organization called NASA said that current technologies could safely remove 10 billion tons of CO2 per year. This is just like, there won't be this much numbers for the rest of it. The reason I wanted these numbers here is to just get an image of the scale of the removals needed. That is a huge, huge amount of scales that I don't think any of us can get our head around. Just how much CO2 we've put into the atmosphere already, and it's already there, and we need to remove it. And I think for me, this means two things. Number one, we're in this for the long haul. We are going to be removing CO2 from the atmosphere for a very long time, and therefore we need to actually be starting to build public support, because something's not going to last for a very long time. It's costing money if it doesn't have public support behind it. So that's one of the real ambitions of Worldwood. And number two, we need new technologies as well, because it's clear the current technologies we have at the current stage of development they are at is not acceptable. In other areas of climate change, like energy and things like that, it is really kind of all right at the moment. In carbon removal, we need a huge scaling up and making cheaper of current technologies and the development of new technologies. So, like, even if we want to reach 1.5 degrees, which I already have said last time, and is basically a rubbish target to have anyway, even if we do that, we need removals possibly up to 1,000 billion tons. So we need huge scales anyway, no matter where we're going to. And if we put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that's more carbon dioxide removal we'll have to do to restore. And we don't know how much carbon dioxide removal is physically possible for us to do. So I think the question is, this is quite daunting, been quite statistics heavy and all that. So I guess the question I have is, can we do it? It's clear that it's a huge scale. It's clear that the technology currently cannot work at that scale. I genuinely cannot say we'll be able to remove enough carbon dioxide to fully reverse all the effects of climate change that we've had. Who knows? I don't think it's, but I think the moonshot analogy is probably a really great one here. When President Kennedy in America set the aim of reaching the moon in 10 years, we did not have the technology to get close to getting to the moon. Man had barely got into space. The difference between getting into space and getting on the moon is huge. We didn't have the tech then. But once we set the aim, the spirit of human endeavor, the spirit of science, that managed to get there. We've got a question in the chat from us. Man hadn't even been into orbit yet by then. That's a really good point that Lucas makes there. Man hadn't even been into orbit when we set our sights on the moon. If we set our sights on something and are determined to do it, then we'll at least get close. We'll at least get close, and the technology will at least get close to getting there. And so that's my thoughts on it. That's why we need this aim of restoration. Because you know what? If we pick an ambition and we really stick to it and we create a movement behind that ambition, then the science will follow. And so that's one of the key things that Worldwood's trying to do. So one of the questions is, how do we do it? So here's a kind of 6-step plan to remove, that was 10, 6-step plan to removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Firstly, we need to remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere in some way. Or we can even remove it from the oceans. Then we need to work out how we're going to store that CO2 safely. Then we need to consider the human impact of doing that removal. Then we need to consider the impact on the ecosystems of doing that removal. Then we need to consider whether we can actually store this CO2 or not. And we also need to consider the costs of doing this, but also the benefits that this might get. And I mean that in a purely economic sense, the economic benefits and the economic costs. The human impacts will include some of the human benefits as well. So I want to start with asking people a question. Does anyone here have any idea of how we could remove CO2 from the atmosphere? Any clues? If anyone wants to contribute, feel free. You're not going to be, you could say you also don't have to contribute. As I said, it's very...
You mentioned this once before, but planting larger scale forests?
So yeah, so tree planting is often one of the really prominently given examples of ways we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And I'm actually going to dedicate an entire webinar into nature-based solutions later on, but we will go into that in more detail. But there's far, far more than trees, and trees alone are not enough. So here's a list of some of the technologies that we can use. Something called BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Something called direct air capture, natural climate solutions, which I'll go into a bit more depth in. I'll go into more depth with actually all three of those. Biochar, which I sadly don't have the time to go into depth to today, but that's a really interesting, exciting technology based off something that indigenous Amerindians did in the Amazon 2,000 years ago. Enhanced weathering and ocean fertilization. These are all potential technologies. I'm not saying they are good. In fact, some of them I vehemently think are very bad. I, for example, personally do not believe that ocean fertilization works and actually thinks it can be highly dangerous. And I'll go into a bit depth. Don't worry, this is just a list of some of the technologies that include. So generally, when people first speak to me about how do we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they think about nature. And I want to present here a video from one organization that's trying to promote the role that nature can play in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And I'll go into detail about some of the things that this video gets right and some of the things this video gets wrong. Sometimes people can't see the videos, in which case tell me, because then I'll exit the sharing and then go back into it. Then you'll be able to see the video. But I hope the video will see first. Oh, and that just didn't work. There. Can everyone see this?
How do we stop the world from spiraling into climate breakdown? We've left it too late to rely only on greening our economies, as well as reducing greenhouse gases to zero. Stopping drastic levels of global heating means we also need to draw carbon dioxide out of the air. But how? Exotic and often dangerous schemes have been proposed, but there's a better and simpler way. Let nature do it for us. When living systems are allowed to recover, they can suck carbon out of the air and lock it up. As forests grow, they turn carbon dioxide into wood. Mangrove swamps and salt marshes build up carbon 40 times faster than forests do. Wet soils like peat turn dead plants into stable carbon stores. The seabed is a massive carbon hoard. It needs protection from trawlers and dredgers. And bringing back wild animals can be amazingly powerful. Wolves lock up carbon dioxide by controlling the animals that eat trees. White rhinos stop big wildfires from forming by preventing dry grass from accumulating. By eating crabs and snails, predatory fish preserve the plants that hold salt marshes together. Nature is our ally in defending ourselves from climate breakdown. A better world for wildlife is a better world for people.
So does anyone want to give their thoughts on that video? Or I can, if no one is particularly keen on it. It's totally fine. So I think one of the things that video gets very right is that last phrase: nature is our ally in combating against climate breakdown, because nature is most certainly our ally. And actually natural climate solutions can play a role. But I also think one of the key things natural climate solutions can do is actually help us with the co-benefits of a lot of these things. Not only do they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but planting trees also provides a habitat for huge amounts of wildlife. And we're facing a biodiversity breakdown at the moment. So tree planting is an obviously good thing as long as you do it in the right way. or things like those salt marshes that it was talking about. That can protect communities and mangrove swamps, communities from massive storms, which are going to come out of the climate crisis, certainly until we've reached restoration. And so, again, it can become our ally. But I think some of the things it also failed to mention is the scale that a lot of these can happen at. A lot of these natural climate solutions can happen at relatively large scales, enough that they can make a dent, but not enough that they can carry the whole picture. Also, the thing it's mentioned is all of those sinks are not permanent. A large storm can basically destroy an entire salt marsh, taking away all the carbon benefits that are taken. A forest fires like the ones we saw in California, and bushfires like the ones we saw in Australia, that can release tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. The bushfires in Australia release 2/3 of Australia's yearly amount of CO2 into the atmosphere. These things are not permanent. Natural climate solutions are brilliant, but there's problems. On the screen, there's a list of potential natural climate solutions, and I'm going to go into detail in 2 of them. So the first one is the one most obvious, the one most people say, which is let's just plant trees. Why don't we just plant tons and tons of trees? And I think there is pros to planting trees. Firstly, a tree does pretty simply take in CO2, take out oxygen. We need less CO2 in the atmosphere, and oxygen's good for us. So therefore, that's brilliant. Plus, trees have loads of co-benefits. They increase biodiversity. We get medicines from trees. We get protection from flooding and from other impacts of climate change. Also, trees provide economic opportunities for local areas. Trees help with huge amounts of things, and trees can be really important also for us keeping biodiversity and nature within our countries. Also, trees intuitively stick with the population. People intuitively think more trees are good, whether people are from the left of the political spectrum or the right of the political spectrum. Almost everyone agrees that trees are good things. And political parties too. You've just got to look at what happened in the most recent UK general election, where each political party was competing to basically have the highest amount of trees that they were planting. So it clearly makes sense to us, and therefore might be a solution that will get continual public support for years to come. Also, we can see the benefits of planting trees because we go to forests and we use them as well. And on the surface, it seems like it's scalable because we can plant loads of trees. And it's true we can plant loads of trees, but not enough. The first main thing I think is the problem is that we don't understand trees actually very well. For example, they release potent and really bad greenhouse gases called volatile organic compounds and methane as well, which can obviously contribute hugely to the climate crisis. We don't actually know how beneficial trees are. Also, if trees are dark, they might actually add to global warming because they reflect less sunlight and actually absorb heat, and therefore adding to the warming. That's called an albedo effect. And if trees reduce the albedo means reflectivity, then they can actually add to global warming. They also can have biodiversity problems. What if we plant trees in areas that were historically grassland? If we want to do it at the scale we need to remove CO2 at the scales people think trees can, then that's actually what we're going to have to do. Plant trees in areas that were historically grassland and are really important. And sometimes if you plant trees in places like peat bogs, trees can actually release CO2 itself as well. And also if you plant the wrong types of trees or trees that are only of one type, then that can again hugely be bad for biodiversity. We can have food supply problems. People need land to grow food. There's a reason why we've cut down so many trees, whether you think it's right or wrong. It's because people need to grow food, but also they need trees for they need land for loads of other economic activity. We need land for our cities. So if there's loads of trees planted, then this often means people can't grow food and therefore might not survive. Also, tree planting has been used as an excuse to steal land from indigenous groups by large transnational corporations. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of stealing land from indigenous groups, which are also already some of the most oppressed groups on earth. Trees are also not a permanent store of CO2. Trees burn. And the trees burning is only going to increase due to climate change. This is not like a safe mechanism of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. As I said, trees are great, and we should be planting as many of them as possible, but they're not enough. And also trees get saturated as well. Before we started emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the world wasn't getting cooler, even though we had way more trees then. Because once trees have removed a certain amount of CO2, they don't actually remove any CO2 anymore. So they won't be able to remove carbon dioxide on the scales and for the amount of time that we really need them to be able to do. I've said those cons, but bear in mind I did title this stumbling blocks, because I wanted to make clear that often cons, we can work past them. Just like with the moonshot, just because we don't know it now doesn't mean it won't be possible in the future. So I presented some possible solutions to these problems of tree planting. Firstly, don't do it at the huge scale required for it to be the only solution. And this is the same as the last one and the last two, really. Let's consider tree planting as part of a diverse array of solutions rather than that's the solution. There's often a word for this, it's called panacea. It's like a cure-all. Trees are not a cure-all for all our problems. Trees are not a cure-all for the only way of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This is on top of, bear in mind, reducing our emissions to zero as well. That's a disclaimer for all of these technologies. But trees shouldn't be the only carbon removal we need because it's not reliable enough and it can also have some problems. We need far more research and do better research into trees. There was something called the Trillion Trees Study, which basically said we could reverse carbon dioxide if we planted 1 trillion trees. The problem was they overestimated the amount of carbon dioxide trees took up. They also didn't count for the albedo effect, the reflectivity effect. They didn't account for methane, didn't account for volatile organic compounds, and put trees in places that trees had never been planted before as well, amongst other things. We actually need much better research on trees, including considering all of these things like albedo, methane, volatile organic compounds, all of these things that could be really difficult. There's also an idea when I talked about farming called agroforestry, which is you do agriculture in amongst trees. And actually you can both plant trees and do agriculture at the same time. That might be a really good idea. But the problem is we don't know at what scales this can work because we've never done agroforestry at huge scales. And also, how do we carry agroforestry out and feed such a huge growing population as well? And also, and this will depend on your view on companies and the extent to which we as individuals and we as have the power to control what they do. But a lot of companies controlling the vast majority of food production might not want to shift to agroforestry because it doesn't favor their type of business model. Whether you think we can deconstruct their business model or not is a very different question, but that's a possible solution. We deconstruct their business model about a possible problem that they won't actually be our allies in helping with this. Other ideas would be empower local communities to forest manage. So you actually, rather than these big companies which might not like it, we actually get smaller local communities. This would also mean that tree planting wouldn't be used to steal land from them because it would be the local communities in charge. But again, lots of governments don't like empowering local communities. So there's problems. I'm not saying that's a good thing, they're governments, but I'm just saying it's not necessarily sure that every government will do this. And finally, we could use managed forests for BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Just keep that in your mind that we can use it for BECCS, because I'm going to explain what BECCS is later, but I don't want to get into too much detail about it now. So does anyone have any comments or questions on tree planting so far? On tree planting or anything? Just feel free to ask or pop it in the chat. All right, fantastic. I'll move on then. So another type is blue carbon, which is getting more prominent. They're previously underused and understudied sink, the oceans. The oceans are a huge sink of carbon dioxide. Firstly, the oceans themselves, as like water, that absorbs most of the carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere anyway. And that's a real problem because it's causing ocean acidification and killing loads of ocean life. But also like the ocean greenery, because oceans are not, a lot of parts of oceans are not blue, they're green. Because of algae, because of phytoplankton, because of kelp, because of seaweed, because of seagrass, because of mangroves, because of all of these things that can suck carbon dioxide out the atmosphere that are based in the oceans. So that's an underused sink. And actually we can use the oceans and use the life in the oceans to really help us remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I think, and the type of blue carbon that I wanted to go into detail about was kelp in particular, and something called ocean afforestation. Kelp grows ridiculously fast. It's like a type of seaweed. I don't know if any of you have seen photos of it, but it grows, it can grow up to like 2 feet a day. So it can suck in and store loads of carbon dioxide really quickly. Each one can't do loads because it grows so quickly. And actually, if we manage it correctly, we can really harness that to remove loads of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Also, it's in water, so it isn't going to burn like normal forests. And because often when these plants die, rather than just staying where they do, they get taken by the currents into deeper oceans until air sacs on the top of the kelp burst and then they sink. Lots of CO2 is taken to depth. At least we think it is. We don't have tons and tons of research on kelp and CO2, so we really need to do more. It could be used to drive BECCS, and you'll, again, I just ask you to keep that in your mind because BECCS is literally our next thing we're doing. So just, you might not understand what that is at the moment. I certainly wouldn't have done if I didn't know what BECCS is, but it's fine. At the moment, kelp itself sequesters as much carbon dioxide as New York emits every year, which is actually about 200 million tons. But at the moment, that's not anywhere near the scales we need in, like to reverse carbon dioxide in any meaningful timescales. Bear in mind, we're needing over 2,000 billion. 200 million is really not a lot in that, but we might be able to enhance the amount kelp can do. We still don't know enough, nor we don't know what we can do to improve those figures. So again, like I said, the moonshot. Keep in mind, just because something might not seem feasible at the moment, doesn't mean not with enough public support and research, we can't achieve it. So now there's another idea to really enhance this. It's called ocean afforestation. This is quite technical. It's also only really based off one paper, so it might not really work, and it needs way more testing. But what it would require is us to grow seaweed at huge scales, building seaweed forests, not just kelp forests, which exist naturally, but other ones elsewhere. We'd be doing ocean farming, as it were. We might build huge rigs that we can then use to grow forests, like seaweed forests, like we do crops today, but in the open ocean. This will require huge technical achievements. But you've just got to look at how much technology has increased in the last 10 years, last 5 years even, to think that for us to say something's technologically impossible, that's just a failure to read how much humans change. I'm not saying this is going to be possible, but I'm saying at least it could. So firstly, we grow seaweed at huge scales. We then digest this methane to biomethane, the seaweed, sorry, to something called biomethane, basically methane generated from biomass plants. Biomass is like living mass, so that's plants in this case. And biomethane, we can then use this biomethane as a fuel by burning it. That means that would be a carbon neutral fuel, because we would have taken the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, then turned it into methane, then put that methane back. So it will be a carbon neutral fuel. So that won't help us with restoration, but that will help us getting to net zero, reducing our emissions. Unless we then extract the greenhouse gases from the biomethane and then store it underground, in which case it will help reverse. It will actually be a fully restorative force. The other thing we do is to then recycle the nutrients from this seaweed, which is going to create money, and therefore means it could potentially fund itself. So this is kind of the dream versus potentially what could the reality be. So if we afforested 9% of the world's oceans, you have to understand that is a huge, huge, huge number. We could, A, in theory, replace fossil fuels using that biomethane, helping us to net zero much easier. And secondly, I couldn't quite remember what timescale this was. I really should have put this in. But over a reasonable timescale, we could remove 53 gigabillion tons of CO2. I think that's like over a couple of years or something. So it's a really short period of time. So we could actually use this to really help eat into it. And that 53 is not limited. We can carry on doing this, because you're cutting them and then you're digesting them and storing them, rather than trees where you're just letting them grow and stay. So this one, it would be constantly replacing them. So therefore would be constantly removing, whilst trees kind of removes, and then just kind of stays. But the question is that feasible? Could we afforest 9% of the world's oceans? That would be like bigger than whole countries. Oh, we've got a question. Okay, fantastic. It was just someone saying they had to go. Is it feasible to do it? And what cost can we do it? Also, with what technology could we remove CO2 from the atmosphere as well? We don't know yet. We don't have this. Sorry, could we use to support these forests? We don't have a technology yet, so we don't know at what cost it will be, and we don't know if it's feasible. These forests could also potentially promote lots of commercial fishing, money, but again, has that been tested? No. Could it work? Yes. Could it also be damaging to the ecosystems? Potentially. It could also combat coastal eutrophication, which is a process that basically means that you lose a lot of basically the waters in coasts become anoxic. They don't have oxygen in them, in theory. But we also don't know if this is going to have other impacts as well. Not the combating coastal eutrophication, but the reduction of these like ocean forests kind of thing. Is that going to negatively impact ecosystems? Is that going to have other knock-on effects? We just don't know. And do we have the technology to do this at the moment? No. So this might be a great dream, but the reality is we have a huge amount of work we have to do to let this dream be realized. I'm not saying it's going to be impossible, We need sustained effort and sustained public advocacy for this as well. Oh, please work. So I said I'd get onto BECCS. BECCS, here it is. So we grow biomass, we grow plants. They call it biomass. BECCS stands for bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, but we can just call them plants because that's what they are. Unless in some cases they're algae and things like that, but it doesn't really matter. And these plants or other things will remove CO2 from the atmosphere. They do the heavy work for us. By photosynthesis, that is kind of a job of plants. We then cut them down if they're trees or if they're like crops, or if we get them from, or even from the ocean, we cut them down. We then replant them. That's a key point. If we don't replant them, this entire thing doesn't work. We then burn the crops that have been cut down for energy inside a power station. That gives us the bioenergy part of it. We then capture the carbon dioxide that's been released from burning them from this concentrated stream of CO2. Because obviously we've taken the carbon dioxide in from the atmosphere into the trees and then we burn them. So actually the air that you've burnt them from is going to have loads of CO2 into it compared to the normal atmosphere. So it's a lot easier to remove a lot of CO2 from that. And that's the carbon capture part of it. And we've got the technology to do this already. And then we can store the CO2 safely underground, as the bit in brackets on the model shows. And that's the storage part. So that is the way it's bioenergy, carbon capture, storage. So what are the pros of this? So firstly, it technologically exists. We have a power station that does something close to this already, which is called Drax, although not necessarily so effectively. I'm not an expert on Drax. Some people accuse them of greenwashing and being really bad. Some people think they're great. I'm not going to make any judgment on them. That's not my role here. It's technologically very easy to carry out compared to some of the other ones. I'm not saying the expertise exists to carry this out. People know how to run power stations. People know how to grow crops. People know how to store carbon dioxide underground. And the supply chains to do this exist somewhat. We can get crops from one side to the other of the world. Like, it's not going to be impossible to do this. Also, energy is produced, so this is a saleable product, but that energy is much more expensive than oil, gas, or which obviously we've got to get off of as quickly as possible, and it's more expensive than wind and solar as well. So I'm not really sure how useful the energy produced is actually going to be. Another advantage is it stores CO2 underground, which, unlike all of the other examples, is permanent, because suddenly we're storing the CO2 underground in oil wells. That's much more permanent than any of the other ones that we've had before. And also oil wells won't get saturated. We've taken all the CO2 and put in the atmosphere from them. So putting it back means like we've got the space there. We know we can do it. Scalable, maybe. Like, we can grow crops in a lot of places, but as you'll see, again, this has a loads of problems. And finally, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change relies on this as well. Relies on this to reach 1.5 degrees. And so, like, it's clear that it has international legitimacy. But I'd say BECCS has lots of problems. Bear in mind, BECCS, also in the pros, here's where it comes, we could use trees to be the feedstocks. You see how, because we cut down the trees, plant new trees, so those trees then suck up more carbon dioxide. Meanwhile, the old trees, we burn them, take the CO2, put the CO2 underground. So it addresses a lot of the problems that we had when we were talking about tree planting. If anyone's unclear on anything, please feel free to ask. Meanwhile, I'm going to mute our new participant. Also, BECCS can display problems with BECCS, though, and I think there is lots of problems with BECCS. Firstly, it can displace food production. We need loads and loads of land to grow for this. The IPCC is saying to reach 1.5 degrees, which is, bear in mind, a lot less ambitious than what I'm proposing. We'd need land 3 times the size of India if we were going to rely on BECCS. We don't have that much land available to use for this. And if we did, we do even have that much land, that's going to displace food production and going to mean millions of people might stop. The larger the scales of BECCS used, the more the land is needed. It will be an excuse. It could be an excuse again to kick indigenous groups off their land because we're using it for BECCS. We'll also compete with other land uses too. Tree planting. We said land use was already a problem with tree planting. We can't have two things which are having huge land use problems going on at huge scales at the same time because they need the same land. So actually, you couldn't just add the amount we could remove from BECCS from tree planting. That wouldn't work. It actually may be physically impossible to do it at the scale necessary because we just don't really know what the human impact of doing it at some of the scales would be need. It may well end up being an excuse for environmental destruction, i.e. to make new space for BECCS. We might have to destroy peat bogs, we might have to destroy forests, we might end up emitting more CO2 than we take out. Also, we don't know how negative the supply chains will be as well. And Drax, again, I said I'm not going to comment too much on their supply chain because I don't know enough about their organization. But they get a lot of their wood from, actually all of their wood from America to Britain, for example. And if we're going to be relying on global supply chains like that, and shipping is one of the most, releases a huge amount of CO2, how useful is BECCS actually going to be at removing the CO2 on the scales that we need? And the real question is, can we provide sustainable amounts of plants, biomass, but can we plant this at a scale that's like good at this scale, but is also socially just as well? Can we do that without endangering people's food supply, so endangering people's lives, and also with endangering loads of other things as well, including environmental destruction? At the moment, it seems like we can't do this. As I've said, if we end up getting things like ocean afforestation working, maybe that could be an alternative. But if we can get some other things from like oceans and things like that, maybe that will become a way of solving the food problem, the land use, but who knows really. That's my assessment of BECCS. BECCS is constantly in discussion because it's, I think we've also got a lot of the expertise to do BECCS already, but whether BECCS can work at the scales we need to carry out restoration, I'm not so sure it does. But I could be proven wrong. We need more research and we need more work done onto it. Because as an idea, it's not inherently flawed. So if we could find ways of getting stuff we can use to drive them, then that would be really useful. And we can actually do that at scales that might help us carry out for restoration. The next technology to use is something called direct air capture. Basically, we build giant reverse fans. We pass CO2 through something called a sorbent, which basically absorbs the CO2 from the atmosphere. And then under heat, generally, there's other chemical processes, different companies use different things. The sorbent will then release the CO2, but into somewhere that we can do it concentrated, like you see within phase 2 of this, which is from a company called Climeworks. And then once we've got the CO2, we take the CO2 and we can either use it in like a fuel that's reaching net zero. That's not going to help us restore. That will help us reach net zero, which is our primary concern. We need to do that first and foremost. Or if we really want to be removing carbon dioxide as well and helping to restore the climate, we could then store it underground. That's the theory of direct air capture. What are the pros? It's potentially very scalable, except for potentially cost-wise, because there's very few land use issues. We don't have to grow lots of crops for this, for example. We'd also potentially have simpler and easier supply chains than BECCS, because we don't need to get plants from one side of the world to another and all sorts of things like that, and make sure that those plants are good and socially justly made and all things like that. It's simpler than that because we're removing it directly from the air. It's modular, i.e. it's made of units. So in theory, it could be much more scalable because we could just build more and more units. There's no reason inherently why we couldn't do that. BECCS, just like BECCS, this leads to permanent storage of CO2 because we store the CO2 underground in these wells, which will stay there, unlike with tree planting, where it's obviously not very great in terms of storing it permanently. It also seems to be very compatible with social justice. We've had a new person come. Hello, Benjamin. I'm just going to put you on mute. For anyone who's new or anything like this, I've said, if you've got any questions, you can just pop them out anytime, put them in the chat, whatever you like. It also seems to be compatible with social justice because it doesn't have those same land use issues, doesn't have that same development issues. Companies that already exist that use this technology, it's not like this technology from science fiction, like this technology exists and works. And there's also interest in it from many areas, whether you like these areas or not. The oil industry has invested hugely in the company that's actually got this plant that you can see in the photo up and running, called Carbon Engineering, as well as Greta Thunberg, which recently visited Climeworks, which is the other company, major company that's doing this. There's a couple of other companies around the world that are also doing this. So it's clearly got interest from a lot of areas. And so clearly this idea might be able to sell on a political level as well. Which is obviously, if we want to pragmatically carry out restoration, we need ideas which are going to be able to get political and company-wide support as well. There's cons of direct air capture. Energy uses. Every type of direct air capture requires a huge amount of energy to use if it's going to remove carbon dioxide at a scale we want it to. And the problem with energy usage is we would need to use renewable sources to do it. And if we've not reached net zero before we start deploying direct air capture at scale, well, those renewable sources would be meaning that we can't be using renewables for other things. So actually, unless we've So for direct air capture to work, it requires us to have got good renewables and to have transitioned the world economy. That's actually not a reason not to use direct air capture. That's yet another reason why we need to reach net zero and transition the global economy away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Also, if you think about it, for certain models, to just achieving 1.5 or 2 degrees, which again is nowhere near at the scales that we need and we want, it would need 1/4 of the world's energy to carry this out. So this needs a huge amount of energy as well. So that might be a problem. Obviously, hopefully we could reduce the energy usage over time, because as I said, with the whole moonshot analogy and all that, things can change. If we put energy, put government money, put company money, put innovation into ideas, then actually we can change how technologies work. The world, the cost of technologies, the benefits and the problems of technologies is not static. That's why I called them stumbling blocks, because some of them might end up insurmountable. We might not be able to carry them out. Some of them will have just tripped over and be able to get back up and actually be able to work out how to get past these problems with things. Another key problem with direct air capture is its cost. At the moment, its cheapest is about $100 per ton of CO2. We need to be removing 2,000 billion tons of CO2 in total. So there's obviously cost problems. I'm not saying we need to do all of that with direct air capture, because I think we need a patchwork of different solutions all working together. But the other thing to keep in mind when people raise costs is costs might reduce. Between 2000 and 2011 in Germany, for example, the cost of solar energy dropped by 75% because of early government support that allowed it to become competitive, allowed innovation to occur. If we had the same degree of government support for direct air capture and allowed to create a competitive marketplace where you get innovation, costs will reduce significantly. But the question is, can we create that marketplace? And also, how far can this remove the costs, reduce the costs? And how far can this innovation also reduce the energy uses as well? These are questions that we need a lot of innovation so we can answer. This is the questions why we need government support, why we need company support, why we need this movement for climate restoration, because we're able to generate that degree of support. The final thing I want to look at here is enhanced weathering. Enhanced weathering is generally considered part of the long-term carbon cycle. And that basically means in the long term, over geologic time, not over human timescales, over millions of years, the way that warming in the past had been reversed, which was not caused by humans, obviously warming in the past, because humans weren't alive then. But this warming we're having at the moment definitely is caused by humans, if anyone has any doubt. And if they need to, there's lots of things you can go look at online that will, and reading stuff that will give this almost 100% scientific consensus. This is caused by humans at the moment. I just wanted to get that one out of the way. And the way warming in the past had been reversed was by CO2, carbon dioxide, being taken into rocks, because rocks react with carbon dioxide in the air. And when they do that, they can actually permanently store that carbon dioxide in them. It's already responsible for the uptake of about 1 billion tons, 1 gigaton of CO2 per year by weathering already. So it can clearly be done at some degree of scale, but it's generally not seen as part of the short-term carbon cycle, which we care about. We don't care about what's happening over millions of years or tens of millions of years. We care what's happening in our lifetime and in our kids' lifetimes. But what if we could speed all of that up, put that all on hyperdrive? How could we do this? Well, if we crush the rocks, if we create a smaller surface area, that will increase the rate of reaction. We could create mini reactors where we can put rocks in that would really help speed up the weathering process by like huge amounts sped up. And also where we once we've crushed it, or once we've created these reactors, where we then put these rocks can really affect it. If it's by coasts, for example, that can really help. The water can help speed up the process. Or if you put it on farmland, all of the biological components can also speed it up. So we can really speed this up. We generally use rocks like olivine, which is the rock you can see here, but also we can use other rocks as well. There's another variant of this, which is we put the rocks, rather than on land, we put them in the ocean, because the ocean is getting more acidic, because it's absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So the carbon dioxide makes the ocean more acidic. When it does this, this is causing huge amounts of damage to huge amounts of marine life, and is in general just making and this can have a huge devastating consequences for both the oceans and for the billions of people that rely on the oceans for their food. If we can put these rocks into the ocean and put rocks that are going to make the ocean more alkaline, then A, that will remove CO2 from the ocean, meaning the ocean might have more room to resolve CO2 from the atmosphere, but it would also help to reverse ocean acidification as well. And that we can use other types of rock as well, not just dolomite. So what are the pros of this? In theory, this is hugely scalable because it doesn't have the same energy use problems, in theory, except for the crushing of the rocks. It also doesn't have the same land use problems that something like BECCS had or something like tree planting had as well. It can be done on both oceans and on land, and there's many different ways to implement, meaning that even if one way we worked out doesn't work, you can still use the expertise to actually investigate other ways. There's loads of possibilities for how we can do this. It could also be one of the only ways to reverse ocean acidification. But the big question, the big thing is, a more alkaline ocean isn't the same as if we hadn't acidified it in the first place. Like, we can't necessarily just reverse it, and this could have some side effects as well. But it is generally like a pro that we can reverse ocean acidification. Again, a massive problem of our time. It's like 1 billion people rely on the ocean for their primary source of food. So, like, did we have a question, by the way? No, we don't. The other thing we can do, for example, is it will also, the carbon dioxide is removed and is stored permanently in this rock. Like, it's pretty permanent storage. So he's going to suffer from the problems like the trees did and things like that. It also doesn't have a huge cost. At the moment, it's $60 per ton of CO2. But actually, this might reduce. Again, just like I said with a direct air capture, we put money into this, put time into this, we can actually reduce it. We also have the expertise already in geology and the supply chain already existing. Mining is the single biggest way we extract stuff from the earth. And actually is one of the biggest human impacts on the world in general. Huge amount of money is in mining, a huge amount of expertise in mining. So we already have that already existing. The supply chains to do this already exist. We don't have a lot of the working out economic problems that we do have with some of the other things with here. We also have co-benefits as well. That's other benefits on the side of just removing CO2. E.g., if we add it to soil, we could increase agricultural productivity, which can make it profitable and could also help to feed a growing human population. But we don't know how profitable. We don't know if it's profitable enough to pay for itself. We just don't know these things. So again, needs more research. I'll go into this in a couple of minutes. There are some cons of advanced weathering. Firstly, just like all technologies, we don't know enough yet. There might be unknown unknowns, i.e. we just don't know at all, of introducing the rocks into the ecosystem. We don't know if that will be a good thing. We don't know if that will be a bad thing. We don't have enough research yet. We've not done enough trials. We also don't know, we do know this, there's a huge environmental, a huge human impact of large scale mining. So we need to be, if we're going to be doing this, and it's going to be compatible with keeping human development up, we need to be making sure we're doing this in a way that's respecting human rights, in the way that's going to respect people's certain health, the way it's going to, because we don't want the solution to be worse than the problem. Inevitably, the impact of mining on this scale won't be as bad as the impact of climate change, because the impacts of climate change are unimaginably bad, and the impacts are happening now. So we need this removal anyway to reverse the impacts we've had. We don't want to be impacting human development. So we need, and also finding energy use of crushing as well. Because it uses a huge amount of energy, and so again has the same fossil fuel problem. There's more solutions as well. Again, I said a lot of these I don't agree with. In fact, a lot of these I think are bad science and don't work. But here's some of the solutions that people have proposed out there. Ocean fertilization, where you basically put nutrients into the ocean to promote the growth of plankton and algae, which then in theory removes CO2 from the atmosphere and goes to the, and therefore will then die and then go to the ocean floor. The problem with that is tests have indicated that doesn't work, and it can have severe ecosystem damages. Iron salt aerosol, which is a very complicated mixture of basically ways that you can insert certain salts into the atmosphere, which can then react with all sorts of things and has all sorts of very complicated impacts. But one of the key problems with that is a large scale ecosystem change that we've had no research into at the moment, really. So I wouldn't rely on that at all. I think it could be severely damaging. We've had just a quick question. Do you think that this is a broad concept? We could have an eco-tax on products based on how bad they are for the environment. Yes, I do think we could have an eco-tax on products, a carbon tax. We already kind of have that in certain countries. But I'm not 100% sure how that's relevant to what we're doing here directly. Potentially that would be a way to pay for a lot of this, but bear in mind we're also looking for restoration. So by the time that we've started doing these at a very large scale, we want to have reduced the environmental impact of almost all our actions to zero anyway. There's also things called biochar, which I might explain later in another one. There's also ways that we can influence the movements of water up and down in oceans. But I'd say a lot of these, particularly the ocean-based ones that require huge changes to the way the ocean-based systems works, is tinkering in a system we don't understand and could actually, in these cases, actually could have damages that is worse than the problem they're trying to solve. And certainly not all of these are feasible. Certainly not all of them are good. In fact, some of these must be hugely damaging. So I'm just going to quickly, unless anyone has any questions, which if everyone does have questions, I'd be more willing to answer. We've got a question here to ask a general question about the environment. Yes, there will be some questions. The time to do those kind of questions, don't worry. We've got a question from, yep.
I wanted to ask about a previous point you made.
Yeah, of course.
What were the effects that you mentioned that ocean deacidization could have?
Well, this is one of the things is that we're not 100% sure because we've never made the ocean more alkaline. We actually only made it more acidic. But the point is the oceans will look different to what they look like if we just reversed it, because it's actually introducing something else into the system rather than just reversing it. So they will look different. And one of my things is the oceans are a really important system for our global climate, but also for our globe as one of the most important global ecosystems. And so because if we don't know the impact, then we could be tinkering in something that could be really damaging to lots of people who rely on the oceans and to the oceans themselves. Did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Any other questions? All right, fantastic. So the next thing I just wanted to set out before we look at why I talked about stumbling blocks is just a quick overview of where these guys fit into Worldwood's model of change. So we view the first priority in everything is achieving net zero. That firstly means reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere to essentially zero by shifting away from fossil fuels and into renewables, by doing so many other changes and things like that to our economies, and what a lot of the conventional climate movement is already campaigning for. Not only do we think their actions are fantastic, but we think they are very, very necessary for having a safe and sustainable future for everyone. But we also want, whilst we're doing that, whilst we're reaching net zero, we also want to scale up to research, have a huge drive to research and promote these technologies and make sure that they can do the cost removal things and all of these things. And once we've done that and worked out which ones work and worked out what scale, we then see these technologies ramped up and put out there in a kind of patchwork fashion. We wouldn't be just relying on one, we'd be using many of these and probably ones which haven't even been invented yet. That's the point of actually getting the government and company funding to do this. And then they would be removing as much CO2 from the atmosphere as possible, hopefully to not only stop the problem getting worse, but actually removing enough to actively make a dent in the amount we put in there already and start making the problem better, start reversing the impact of climate change that we've had. If any of you missed my last webinar, I'll be doing a similar webinar in a couple of weeks, which really explained why the restoration is necessary beyond what we're doing. But Worldwood would be using these technologies in our model of ideas. We're an advocacy organisation, but governments and companies would hopefully use these technologies to actually help restore and repair the climate we've got. So why did I use the term stumbling blocks? Because I wanted to create two things. Firstly, optimism versus pessimism. We could say direct air capture is too expensive, so therefore won't ever be useful. Or we could say at the moment it's too expensive, so might not be useful, but with enough support from companies and from entrepreneurs and from governments, then we might be able to reduce the price to enough that it is. A pessimist would have said solar would never be competitive with fossil fuels, and now it is actually outcompeting it in some places in the world. So stumbling blocks, because we don't know how much of these are severe problems, which will mean we can't do it, and how many of these are actually just things that we need to work around. And also realism versus idealism, because we could also say none of these have any problems, but of course they do. But we also need to be realistic about it and say some of these problems will limit the scale, but doesn't mean we can't work around the problems. doesn't mean we can't solve them. I go back to the moonshot again. We didn't have the ability to get to the moon when we said we'd do it. We hadn't even really got into orbit on Earth, but we got there because we had the drive to do it. We don't have the technologies available today or the political will available today to carry out restoration. But with enough drive, with enough human ambition, with enough human endeavor, we will make it there. And this is where research comes in. We need research to come from companies and from governments. We need research coming from entrepreneurs and scientists. We need so much research being done now. And the research, this is one of the things that needs to be done now before we reach net zero, so we can carry out these the restoration. Because if we leave it into the future, then the timescales we're looking at for restoration, millions of people would already have died. We cannot afford that. We need to start the research now. And this is one of the reasons why Worldwood does not advocate for any specific technology, because we don't know which one of the problems will be workarounds yet. We can say whether we personally believe technologies will work or not. A lot of this being my personal views, we don't advocate for any specific technology. I think that's an important point, because it's really about galvanizing action so governments and companies can work to making these technologies as best as possible and can work out which ones will be most effective. And the final thing is really, why public knowledge? Why am I doing this webinar? Why is Worldwood promoting huge amounts of public knowledge into these technologies? Well, the first thing is that the public and politicians can be misled. These technologies, whether we end up achieving restoration or not, and I really, for the good of millions of people over the world, hope that we do commit to restoration. But these technologies will become a bigger player in the world picture, full stop. And if people are more knowledgeable, then they will be less likely to be misled by politicians. And if people are more knowledgeable, then politicians are also more likely to be more educated. And therefore, there's less likely to be misleading by companies that are trying to use this to greenwash, to pretend they're doing all good stuff, but they're actually not. Public understanding of science has always been a key way to reverse the climate crisis, because knowledge is power. And a knowledgeable and active public that can know when they're being fed absolute rubbish, that is what's going to drive action. That's what's going to drive restoration. And finally, it can help reverse the panacea narrative, the idea that there's some cure-all to the climate crisis. Because if we know the limits of these technologies, we know the limits of these techniques, we can actually help to reverse that narrative and actually help to get a better picture of the world that will allow us to carry out restoration and allow us to save millions of people's lives. So I guess the question is, before I open this up to a full range of questions and discussions, is what's next? Well, there's a couple of things you can do. If you want to get more involved in Worldwood and this has made you passionate, sign up for our volunteer program, or sign up to be a volunteer for us, where we'll train you in all the things you need to know about restoration and really give you the ability to help make this exciting movement. We've had the first of our volunteer program started, and we're really looking to expand our movement. So if any of you wants to join, please do. You can attend these weekly webinars, and when I move on from introductory webinars to advanced webinars, you can also go onto those. Check out the resources on our website. We've got a ton of resources on loads of stuff. And go away and research for yourself. There's awesome stuff out there on the internet, awesome stuff out there on YouTube. Be an agent for knowledge and be an agent for change in the world, because then we can change the world. Thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to just pop them in and pop them in the chat about anything. Oh, yeah, Benjamin has a question here. And then we'll go to whoever asked the question in the chat. I'll go to Benjamin first, and then Benjamin.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay. I think what was advocating pouring loads of money into research. That's your main drive. What about all those millions dying in the global south, which we need to be, plugging millions, if not billions of pounds in aid to the global south, refugee, famine, things like that. What do you say to that?
So I'd actually say yes, we do need to put money into that, but that's from a personal perspective. I also think that the amount of money you're looking at isn't actually too much. The amount of money we need for research isn't billions and billions. It's an allocation more of where research funding is at the moment, but also giving tax breaks, giving subsidies. It doesn't just need to be money into research. It's also other ways that we can prop up companies, small companies and things like that can drive this. Also, we have a lot of money going into research anyway, because the way that we improve human development is by helping to advance one of the ways is by helping to advance science. And so
in which case I'd ask,
anyway, it would partially be allocation of that. And the final thing is, one of the best ways we can help people in the global south and stop those famines happening is carrying out restoration. Because frankly, all of that money we're pouring into there, if we don't end up stopping the climate crisis, will basically mean nothing. Because
So I'd ask, if we're plugging money into research already, how much more do we need to go?
we're not putting it into this research. That's the point. It's where the research money is going as well.
In terms of figures, how much do you envisage more needs to be put in?
I'm not 100% sure. I think as I always kind of say, it's not, and this is one of the things I want people to come up with policies. There's work done by the Royal Society into this as well. But it will be, for different technologies, it will be different things. We don't know how much money it will be. And I would also bear in mind, the research works internationally as well. So it's not just in national governments. I'm very proud that the British government has recently announced money that might be going into carbon removal. So that'd be really good if that ends up happening. And they've already been running other projects into carbon removal as well. And that's a really good start, but just more money needs to be put in as well. I don't think the scales we're looking at is of the amount of money needs to go into this would actually be a drop in the water of research funding that already exists. It's not like we're diverting huge amounts of money into researching this anyway. And once, and bear in mind, it will also be companies. If governments put subsidies and tax breaks and all things like that, companies will help drive it too. In fact, companies have been the ones driving the research so far, if you look at the examples I gave you before. I'm now moving to the chat for some questions there, because I had at least 2 questions in there. So I had a question here, and actually I think this is a really legitimate question about the impact of quarantine and coronavirus on the environment in general. And I'd say there's a few things to that. Firstly, I fully disagree with anyone calling the coronavirus a good thing. It has killed thousands of people around the world, many of the most vulnerable people around the world, and I never take happiness in human suffering. That's the reason I'm in this. That's the reason that I want to carry out climate restoration. So I'm never going to praise something that's going to be causing human suffering anyway. But I also don't think it's having as much of a positive impact as we think. Number one, in the broader, in the large scale things, when we will end up coming out of quarantine and economic recovery, that might end up releasing a lot of the CO2 anyway back into the atmosphere, i.e. the CO2 that we, because economic growth will obviously drive carbon dioxide emissions, and therefore we might end up actually this being a little blip in the long trajectory. So in the grand scheme of things, not being significant. And the final thing is, this has delayed, and I'm speaking actually to people that work on international climate negotiations, including in the UN, and this has hugely delayed the climate negotiations internationally by 6 months or more. And that seems not a lot, but on the timescales we're working at, in trying to avoid 1.5 degrees, and then once we've avoided 1.5 degrees, I hope carrying out restoration. If we go beyond 1.5 degrees or beyond 2 degrees, I don't, restoration will become less and less likely to happen. And so losing 6 months really significant. And that might, and actually that will lag behind carbon emissions, because once countries internally open up and start emitting carbon dioxide again, international flights won't necessarily resume, international conferences won't resume. So it might end up having a negative impact again on the climate. So that would be my response to that question. There's lots of other responses out there as well. Has anyone else got any other questions related to restoration, all these technologies, or anything else, or wanting to know anything else about Wildwood? It's really an open floor to anyone. All right. I'd just say thank you all very, very much for coming. It's been a really enjoyable thing. This has been recorded, so it's going to go up onto our website soon. And I'd just like to say, if anyone wants to sign up for our volunteer program, where we go into a lot more detail and really help you fully understand this, if anyone wants to, or wants any suggestions of things they can do to get involved and help to carry out the vision of restoration in general, please contact me. My email address is gfutterman, GFUTERMAN @wildwood.org, or contact me by any other means if you have them. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.